So now we consider the potential impact of parasite life histories on their virulence evolution. So parasites have certain characteristics that can affect the utility of lesser or greater virulence in terms of transmission potential. And this is, for example, parasites that require direct contact for transmission tend to display lower virulence because their host vector typically is more effective if ambulatory. Sexually transmitted diseases additionally require sexual functionality and desire, so hence tend to display low virulence, at least in the short term. Sexual transmission is a special kind of direct contact transmission. Parasites that display high extraorganismal durability, by contrast, can get away with higher virulence by displaying a sit-and-wait transmission strategy. So what we'll be doing is walking through various scenarios for parasite transmission and considering how all of these impact the potential for higher virulence to evolve in these parasites. So the impact of parasite life histories. So parasites that are transferred by vectors, such as by arthropod vectors, can benefit from host sickness, such that the vector is less likely to be shooed away, for example. Therefore, these parasites that are transferred by arthropod vectors often can get away with displaying a significant amount of virulence. And this also can be the case for attendant-borne diseases, where the attendant, such as in a clinic, can serve as the vector of disease transmission. Again, an individual can be pretty sick, but a nurse, for example, can still very readily come in contact with these individuals and potentially transmit infectious diseases from, as well as to, these individuals. Parasites that employ host disease as part of their transmission strategy can also benefit from significant virulence. So an example of this would be diarrhea as a means of transmission out of an individual. Also, there are a couple of cases where organisms actually melt in response to infections, such as the case with Ebola, where individuals bleed out, and baculovirus, which is an infection of insect, such as caterpillars. And then there's also a possibility that childbirth fever from the 19th century displayed this kind of increase in virulence as a consequence of using host disease as a mechanism of transmission, or at least a component of their mechanism of transmission. The hypothesis here is that what you had are individuals that went to hospitals to give birth, and if those individuals happen to contract childbirth fever and die, childbirth fever is caused by Streptococcus pyogenes, and die in the hospital, then they would be autopsied by the physician, who then would move on to the next individual who they would aid in childbirth, potentially transmitting the childbirth fever, the streptococcus, to this next individual. It was those individuals who died in the hospital that would be autopsied and therefore would have the highest potential for transmitting the pathogen to the next susceptible host. And therefore, those individuals that were experiencing a higher level of disease, those pathogens that affected a higher level of virulence, that kept the individuals in the hospital and caused them to die there, would be selected for within these systems. And so higher levels of disease, in this case, seems to have given rise to a greater level of contact with the vector for disease transmission, the attending physician, and as a consequence, maybe a higher level of virulence actually evolved in that system. I should point out before going further that this occurred in the days before physicians actually washed their hands between patients. This is very much prior to the full implementation of what we understand now about the utility of hand washing as supplied to us by Semmelweis, who actually, ironically, also died of a Streptococcus pyogenes infection. So If we think of acute infections, so these are infections that last relatively short periods of time. For acute infectious diseases, theory about the evolution of virulence focuses on the negative effects of virulence on the transmission of pathogens between hosts. Much of the variation in these negative effects of virulence depends on whether pathogens can be transmitted from hosts that have become immobilized by the infections. Pathogens that can be transmitted readily from immobile hosts should be molded by natural selection to exploit the host severely and to be highly virulent. The reason is simple. Variants that exploit severely gain the competitive advantages of this exploitation. That is, they win the within-host competition for increasing expedience, while incurring little, if any, competitive cost from the illness that their exploitation generates, because they still can be transmitted from hosts that have severe immobilizing illness. So if you can knock out your host to the point where the host isn't even able to move around and yet still be transmitted from that host, there's little keeping you from severely victimizing the host, from displaying a large amount of virulence by causing a large amount of disease. To some degree, this is similar to that example of childbirth fever, where it was the individuals that were sufficiently immobilized that they actually stayed in the hospital and died there, that were more likely to be transmitted by the doctors who conducted the autopsies and then moved on to other potential hosts. And this is my example of what this all looks like. If when I was home, immobilized, sick in bed, if I could still transmit, then there'd be nothing keeping the parasite from making me really, really, really sick to the point where I was immobilized at home in bed. And in fact, as we'll see, I mean, this is something that it may very well be relevant in terms of transmission within hospitals. But if it's the parasite instead needs to actually have its host be moving around among other hosts in order for transmission to take place, to not be immobilized, then lower levels of virulence may be selected for in order to enhance the potential for transmission of the parasite.